There are places on this planet that don't feel like they belong to the timeline we've been told. Structures built with a level of precision that seems out of place. Entire cities shaped into mountains, deserts, and cliffs. And systems designed so carefully, they still function thousands of years later. Across different continents, in completely different environments, the same pattern keeps appearing. Not random construction, but understanding. These aren't stories, they're real, studied, measured, and still not fully explained. If that kind of mystery pulls you in, you're not alone. Comment below. Where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Settle in. The ancient observatory that tracks seasons. In the remote high desert of New Mexico, far from modern cities and far from anything that feels connected to the present, there is a place where stone structures stretch across the landscape in a way that feels both deliberate and difficult to explain. This is Chaco Canyon. At first, it doesn't immediately stand out. The terrain is open, dry, and quiet, with low ridges and wide skies that make everything feel distant. But as you move through the canyon, the scale begins to reveal itself slowly, almost without warning. Large stone complexes appear, built with precision, aligned with the land, and arranged in ways that suggest planning rather than chance. One of the most well-known of these structures is Pueblo Bonito. It doesn't rise sharply like a fortress or monument. Instead, it spreads outward in a curved shape, forming a massive multi-room complex that once held hundreds of interconnected spaces. The walls are built from carefully shaped sandstone, stacked in layers with a level of consistency that suggests control, not improvisation. And yet, what makes this place unusual is not just how it was built, it's how it's positioned. Because Chaco Canyon is not random, the structures here follow patterns. Subtle at first, but once noticed, difficult to ignore. Doorways align. Windows frame specific directions. Walls correspond to angles that don't seem necessary for simple construction. And then, over time, a pattern begins to emerge. The sun becomes part of the structure. During certain times of the year, light enters specific openings and falls across interior walls in a controlled way. Not scattered, not accidental, but precise enough to suggest intention. At sunrise during the solstices, light aligns with architectural features, marking moments that repeat every year. That detail changes how the site is understood. Because this is no longer just a settlement, it's a system, a place where architecture and sky are connected. And that requires observation, not just once, but over long periods of time. Tracking the movement of the sun across the horizon, noticing where it rises and where it sets, and then translating that information into stone. That kind of work doesn't happen quickly. It builds slowly, through repetition, through memory, through shared knowledge passed from one generation to the next. And that raises a deeper question. Who were the people capable of doing this? The site is associated with the ancestral Puebloans, a culture that lived in this region for centuries. They built not only here, but across a network of sites connected by roads that extend far beyond the canyon itself. And those roads are another detail that stands out. Straight. Extremely straight. Cutting across the landscape in lines that don't follow the easiest path, but the most direct one. Some stretch for miles, connecting distant locations with a level of precision that suggests planning at a large scale. Which means Chaco was not isolated, it was central. A hub. And that adds another layer to its purpose. Because if people were traveling here, gathering here, building here, then this place was more than just a settlement. It was important. And then there's something else. Just outside the main structures, on nearby rock faces, there are markings, petroglyphs, simple at first glance, but positioned in ways that interact with light and shadow. One of the most well-known examples is often referred to as the sun dagger. During the summer solstice, a beam of sunlight passes through a gap in the rock and cuts across a spiral carving, splitting it in a precise way. At other times of the year, the light moves differently. That's not accidental, that's alignment. Which means the builders were not only aware of solar movement, they were tracking it with accuracy. And that brings the focus back to time, because tracking the sun is not just about observation, it's about understanding cycles, seasons, changes in the environment, moments that determine when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare. And in a landscape like this where conditions can shift, that knowledge becomes essential. But even with all of that understood, there are still details that remain unclear. Because the scale of construction at Chaco is significant. The coordination required to build structures like Pueblo Bonito, to align them with celestial events, and to maintain connections across long distances suggests a level of organization that goes beyond what is immediately visible. And then, around the late 12th century, something changes. The canyon is gradually abandoned. Not destroyed, not erased, but left behind. The structures remain, the alignments remain, the roads remain, but the people do not. And that creates a different kind of question. Not just how it was built, but why it left. Because places like this are not temporary. They are developed over time, expanded, maintained, and leaving them suggests something significant, something that altered the need for the place, or made it impossible to continue. There are theories: environmental change, drought, resource depletion, all possible, but none fully explain the scale of the shift, because Chaco was not just a location, it was a system, and systems don't disappear without reason. What remains today is the structure of that system: stone walls, open spaces, alignments that still interact with the sun exactly as they did centuries ago. Because the movement of the sky hasn't changed, the sun still rises, still sets, still marks time across the same horizon, and the architecture still responds, exactly as it was designed to, which means that whatever knowledge was used to create this was accurate enough to outlast the people who built it, and remain not fully explained, but still functioning. And maybe that's what makes Chaco Canyon different, because it doesn't just show that people were here, it shows that they understood something about time, something about movement, something about the connection between earth and sky. And they built it into stone, not to be seen once, but to be seen again, and again, every year, as long as the sun continues to rise. The rock formation that looks artificial. Rising from the plains of northeastern Wyoming, there is a structure that doesn't feel like it belongs to the landscape around it. The ground stretches flat in every direction, covered in grass and low hills, and then suddenly, without transition, something vertical appears. A massive tower of stone, steep, uniform, almost too precise. This is Devil's Tower. From a distance, it looks unnatural, not because it's out of place, but because of how defined it is. The sides rise almost straight upward, forming long vertical columns that run from the base to the top, as if the entire structure was carved rather than formed. And that's the first thing that stands out. The surface isn't random, it's patterned. Parallel lines, repeating across the entire formation, creating a texture that feels organized rather than chaotic. And that's where the questions begin. Because natural rock formations don't usually look like this. They erode unevenly. They break irregularly. They form shapes that feel unpredictable. But this feels controlled, as if something shaped it with intention. And yet it wasn't. According to geology, Devil's Tower is the result of volcanic activity that took place millions of years ago. Magma pushed upward beneath the surface, cooling slowly as it rose. Over time, it hardened into rock, and as the surrounding material eroded away, this structure was left behind. That explanation is accepted. But the details are what make it unusual, because when magma cools slowly, it can form columns, not random shapes. columns, hexagonal, sometimes pentagonal, long, straight, and tightly packed together. And that's exactly what we see here. Thousands of stone columns fitted side by side, rising vertically as a single structure, each one separate, but part of a larger whole. And that creates an effect that doesn't feel natural at first glance, because the human mind recognizes patterns. And this looks like construction, like something assembled, even though it isn't. And that contrast is what makes the site so striking, because it exists in a space between perception and explanation. It looks artificial, but it isn't. And that tension stays, even after you understand how it formed. Standing at the base, the scale becomes clearer. The columns are massive, some wider than a person, extending upward for hundreds of feet. The surface isn't smooth, but the structure is consistent enough to feel intentional. And then there's the top. Flat, almost level, as if the structure was cut. But it wasn't. It's simply the result of erosion and time. The upper surface exposed after everything around it wore away. And that adds another layer to the illusion, because now it doesn't just look constructed, it looks finished. Which leads to another thought. Because formations like this are rare, not impossible, but uncommon at this scale. And that rarity makes it stand out even more. It becomes something the mind tries to explain beyond the obvious. And that's where stories begin. For many Native American tribes, Devil's Tower holds cultural and spiritual significance. Different traditions describe it in different ways, often connected to animals, movement, or events that shaped the land. In one story, the vertical grooves along the sides are said to be marks left by a giant bear clawing its way upward. And while that is symbolic, it reflects something real. The pattern, the lines, the structure that invites interpretation. Because when something looks this unusual, it doesn't stay just a formation. It becomes meaning. And then there's the question of time. Because this structure didn't appear suddenly. It formed slowly, over millions of years. The magma cooled. The rock hardened. The surrounding layers eroded away. And what remains is what we see now. Which means this is not something that was built. It was revealed, gradually, as everything around it disappeared. And that idea shifts the perspective again. Because instead of asking how it was made, the question becomes why it looks the way it does. Why the columns form so uniformly. Why the structure remained intact while everything else eroded. And the answer returns to the same place. Conditions. Pressure, cooling rate, all aligning in a way that produced something rare, but still natural. And maybe that's the most important part. Because sometimes nature creates patterns that feel intentional. Structures that look designed. Forms that resemble something built, even when they aren't. And Devil's Tower is one of those places. A formation that challenges perception. Not because it breaks the rules of geology, but because it follows them in a way that looks unfamiliar. And that's enough to make it stand out, even now, rising above the plains, unchanged, recognizable, from miles away, and still carrying that same question. Not whether it was built, but why it feels like it was. The circular Neolithic enclosures. In the Alentejo region of southern Portugal, where the land opens into wide, quiet fields, there is a place that doesn't immediately reveal what it is. From the ground, it feels ordinary. Low terrain, open sky, nothing that suggests complexity. But from above, the pattern appears. Concentric circles, faint at first, then clearer. Rings carved into the earth expanding outward in layers, forming a structure that is too precise to be natural and too large to be understood at a glance. This is perdigones. And what makes it unusual is not just its shape, but how it was made. Because these circles are not built upward, they are cut downward. Ditches. Wide curved trenches dug into the ground, forming enclosures that wrap around a central space. The earth removed from these trenches was used to build low embankments, creating boundaries that are visible even after thousands of years. At first, it might seem simple: digging, shaping, arranging. But the scale changes that. Because this is not a single circle, there are multiple, layered, interconnected, expanding across the landscape in a way that suggests planning from the beginning, not gradual expansion without direction. And that raises the first question: why circles? Because straight lines are easier to measure, easier to construct, but circles require control. You need a center point. You need distance to remain consistent. You need coordination. And maintaining that shape across a large area requires intention, which means this wasn't random. It was designed. The site dates back to around 3,400 to 2000 BCE, placing it firmly in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, a time when communities were developing agriculture, settling more permanently, and beginning to organize space in new ways. And that context matters, because structures like this are not about survival alone. They represent something more: a gathering, place, a boundary, a marker. But of what? Excavations at Perdigones have revealed a range of activity: human remains, animal bones, fragments of pottery, objects that suggest repeated use over long periods of time, which means this was not a one-time construction. It was a place people returned to, again and again, over generations. And that changes the interpretation, because now this isn't just a structure, it's a process, a location that held meaning, possibly ceremonial, possibly social, possibly both. And then there's the orientation. Some of the enclosures appear to align with celestial events, particularly the setting sun during certain times of the year. Not with perfect precision, but close enough to suggest awareness. And that brings back a familiar idea, because across different regions, early societies were watching the sky, tracking movement, recognizing patterns, and incorporating that knowledge into the ground beneath them, making something invisible visible. And here, that idea takes the form of circles, expanding outward, layer after layer. And then there's something else: the entrances. Because these enclosures are not completely closed. There are openings, gaps in the circles that allow movement from one layer to another. And these openings are not random. They are positioned, aligned, which suggests controlled access, a way of entering, a way of moving through the space. And that detail matters, because it turns the structure into more than a boundary. It becomes a path, a sequence, from outside to inside. And that kind of design appears in other ancient sites, spaces that are meant to be experienced, not just observed, where movement itself becomes part of the meaning. And then there's the scale of time, because Perdigones was used for centuries, which means the people who built it did not just create it, they maintained it, they returned to it, they added to it, which suggests continuity, a shared understanding that lasted beyond a single generation. But eventually, that continuity ends. The site is abandoned, not destroyed, not erased, but left. And over time, the earth softens the edges. The ditches fill partially, the embankments settle, and the pattern fades, until it is only visible from above. And that changes how it is experienced, because from the ground it becomes subtle, easy to miss, but from the sky, the design returns, clear, intentional, undeniable, which means the structure still exists, not as it was, but enough to be recognized. And that raises one final thought, because the people who built this never saw it from above. They never saw the full pattern at once, and yet they created it, which means they understood it without needing to see it. They worked from knowledge, from plan, from something that existed before the first ditch was dug. And that may be the most important detail, because it shows that even at this early stage, there was structure, there was intention, there was understanding of space, movement, and pattern, and they placed it into the earth, not to stand above it, but to be within it. And even now, thousands of years later, the circles remain, faint, quiet, but still there, holding the shape of something that once mattered, even if we no longer fully understand why. The megalithic tomb beneath the mound. On the Orkney Islands, off the northern coast of Scotland, there is a grassy mound that doesn't immediately reveal what it holds. It rises gently from the surrounding land, blending into the landscape in a way that feels natural at first glance. Wind moves across it. Rain settles into the soil. From a distance, it looks like part of the terrain itself, but it isn't. Beneath that mound, there is a structure. This is Maeshowe, a chambered cairn built thousands of years ago, during the Neolithic period, long before written history, long before most of the monuments we recognize today were even imagined. And what makes it unusual is not just that it exists, but how it was built. The entrance is narrow, a low passage cut through the mound, lined with carefully placed stones, leading inward in a straight line. It doesn't open immediately into space. Instead, it draws you forward slowly, forcing you to lower yourself as you move through it. And that experience feels intentional, because the transition from outside to inside is gradual. Light fades behind you. Sound changes. The space narrows before it opens. Until suddenly, you reach the chamber, a central room constructed from large stone slabs, fitted together with precision. The walls rise vertically, meeting at a ceiling formed by overlapping stones that create a kind of corbelled dome. It doesn't feel fragile. It feels contained, balanced, stable in a way that doesn't suggest improvisation. And that's where the first question begins. Because this was not carved out of solid rock. It was built. Stone brought here, placed, arranged, each slab positioned to support the others. And that requires planning. Because the chamber is not random in its shape. It is structured, with side cells branching from the main room, small spaces that extend outward but remain connected to the center, which suggests purpose, not just burial, but arrangement, because spaces like this are designed not just to exist, but to function. And then there's the alignment, because the passage leading into Maeshowe is not oriented randomly. It faces a specific direction, toward the setting sun during the winter solstice. And for a few days each year, something happens. As the sun lowers on the horizon, light enters the passage. It travels through the narrow corridor and reaches the central chamber, illuminating the interior in a way that doesn't occur at any other time. That detail changes everything, because now the structure is not just a tomb, it's a marker, a point of connection between the earth and the sky, and that requires knowledge. Observation of the sun's movement across the year, recognition of its lowest point during winter, and the ability to translate that into architecture. That's not simple. It takes time. Generations, possibly, watching, recording, remembering, and then building something that captures that moment. Exactly. And that brings the focus back to the people who built it, because this level of construction suggests more than survival. It suggests intention beyond immediate need, effort directed toward meaning, toward something symbolic, possibly connected to cycles, to death, to renewal, ideas that appear across many early cultures, but here they take physical form, stone, aligned, precise. And then there's something else, because Maeshowe was not left untouched. Centuries later, it was entered again, by a different group, Norse visitors, who left markings inside the chamber, runes carved into the stone, messages, names, traces of people who came long after the structure was built. And that creates a layered history, because now the site is not just Neolithic. It carries multiple moments in time, different uses, different meanings, all within the same space, and yet the original structure remains intact. The chamber still holds, the passage still aligns, the light still enters during the solstice exactly as it did thousands of years ago. which means the design worked, not just once, but continuously, across time. And maybe that's the most important detail, because whatever knowledge was used to build this was accurate enough to last, accurate enough to remain functional long after the people who created it disappeared. And that leaves a quiet kind of mystery, not about what it is, but about what it meant. Because standing inside that chamber, surrounded by stone that has held its position for thousands of years, the space feels deliberate, not just constructed, but intended, for something we no longer fully understand. And yet, every year, when the sun reaches that same point on the horizon, the light still finds its way inside, exactly as it was meant to. The early farming settlement. In the plains of what is now Balochistan, Pakistan, there is a site that doesn't stand out because of massive structures or towering stone walls. It is quieter than that, lower, more subtle. But what it represents is much earlier. This is Mergar, and it dates back to around 7000 BCE, a time long before cities, long before large-scale monuments, long before what we usually think of as organized civilization. At first, the remains don't feel extraordinary. Mud brick structures, simple layouts, fragments of daily life. But the significance is not in how it looks, it's in when it existed. Because Mergar represents one of the earliest known farming settlements in South Asia. And that changes the perspective immediately. Because before this point, human societies were mostly mobile, moving, following food, following seasons. But here, something different begins. People stay, they build, they return to the same place. And that shift is important because farming changes everything. It creates stability, it creates surplus, and eventually it creates structure. At Mergar, there is evidence of early agriculture, wheat, barley, domesticated animals, storage areas, which means this wasn't temporary occupation. It was sustained, organized, and over time, it grew. The settlement expanded, structures became more defined, activities became more specialized, and that suggests development, a gradual increase in complexity, not sudden, but steady. And then there's something else, because Mergar doesn't just show farming, it shows early craftsmanship, beads, ornaments, objects made from materials not found locally, which suggests trade, movement of goods, connection between different regions, even at this early stage. And that's significant, because it means this was not an isolated community, it was part of something larger, a network, still forming, still evolving, but present. And then there's the question of knowledge, because farming requires understanding, timing, seasons, water, soil, knowing when to plant, when to harvest. And that knowledge doesn't appear instantly. It develops through observation, through repetition, through failure and adjustment, and the fact that it exists here, at this point in time, suggests that the process had already begun earlier, which means Mergar is not the beginning. It's a continuation, a point where something that started before becomes visible. And that idea shifts the timeline, because it suggests that organized human activity developed gradually, in ways that are not always fully recorded, only partially preserved, through sites like this. And then there's the structure of the settlement itself. The buildings are arranged in clusters, rooms connected, spaces defined, not random placement, but organization, which suggests planning, even at a basic level. And that matters, because planning space means thinking beyond the present moment. It means considering how things will function over time. And that's a different kind of thinking, one that moves toward permanence. And then, over centuries, the site changes. New layers appear, different techniques, different materials, evidence of progression, which means Mergar was not static. It evolved, and eventually it was abandoned. Not suddenly, but gradually, as population shifted, as new centers developed elsewhere, and that creates a pattern, Because early settlements like this don't disappear completely. They transform. The knowledge moves, the people move, and what remains is the origin, the early stage of something that will later become more visible, more complex, more recognizable. And maybe that's the most important part. Because Mergar doesn't stand out because of scale, it stands out because of timing. Because it shows a moment when human life began to change, from movement to settlement, from temporary to permanent. And that shift is not dramatic, it's quiet, gradual, but it leads to everything that comes after: cities, systems, structures, and eventually, the kind of places that dominate history. But here, at Mergar, it is still simple, still early, still forming, and that makes it easy to overlook. But it shouldn't be, because without places like this, the later ones don't exist. And even now, the remains sit quietly in the landscape, low, subtle, but holding the trace of something important. A beginning, not the first, but one of the earliest we can still see. The Neolithic stone houses. On the western edge of mainland Scotland, where the Atlantic wind moves constantly across the coastline, there is a settlement that remained hidden for centuries beneath layers of sand and earth. It wasn't discovered through excavation at first or through deliberate search. Instead, a storm exposed it. The wind stripped away the surface, revealing something that had been sealed for thousands of years. What emerged was not a single structure, but an entire village. This is Skara Brae. At first glance, it feels unexpectedly complete. Unlike many ancient sites where only fragments remain, here the layout is still visible, the space is still defined, and the arrangement still clear enough to understand how people once lived. The houses are built from stone, not stacked loosely, but fitted in a way that creates enclosed, stable interiors. Thick walls protect against the wind, while the structures themselves are partially set into the ground using the earth as insulation. This design is not accidental. It responds directly to the environment, shaping the settlement in a way that makes it sustainable over time. Inside the houses, the details become more striking. Stone beds are built along the walls. Storage compartments are integrated into the structure itself. And directly across from the entrance, in nearly every house there is a larger stone feature, often interpreted as a kind of dresser or central display space. The repetition matters, because it suggests consistency, a shared understanding of how these spaces were meant to function. The layout of the village also follows a pattern. The houses are connected by narrow, covered passageways, allowing movement between structures without full exposure to the outside. This creates a network rather than isolated units, a system where each part is linked to the others. It's compact but organized. And that organization reflects something important, because this settlement dates back to around 3100 BCE, making it older than the pyramids of Egypt. At that time, large stone monuments were rare, and yet here is a community not only building with stone, but shaping it into a functional living environment with a level of consistency that suggests planning. And that raises a question. Not just how it was built, but how it was maintained. Because structures like this require effort over time. Stone needs to be placed, adjusted, repaired, spaces need to be kept usable, and that implies continuity. A population that remained here long enough to develop and sustain the system. The presence of tools, pottery, and everyday objects supports that idea. These were not temporary shelters. This was a place of routine, of repeated activity, of daily life carried out within a structure that was clearly understood by the people who used it. And then there is the environment itself. At the time Skara Brae was occupied, the climate may have been slightly more stable than it is now, but it was still coastal, still exposed, still shaped by wind and sea. Building here required adaptation, and the settlement reflects that. Lowered profiles, thick walls, connected spaces, each decision reinforcing the others, creating a system that works as a whole rather than as separate parts. But even with all of this understood, there are details that remain uncertain. Because while we can see how the structures were used, we don't fully know why this specific layout was chosen, or why certain features appear in every house. The central stone dresser, for example, is too consistent to be incidental, yet its exact purpose is still debated. And then there's the question of why the settlement was eventually abandoned. There is no clear evidence of destruction, no sign of sudden collapse. Instead, it appears that the site was gradually covered by sand, possibly due to changing environmental conditions. Over time, the entrances were blocked, the structures buried, and the village disappeared from view. And that creates a different kind of preservation. Because instead of being exposed to constant change, Skara Brae was sealed, protected. The walls remained. The layout remained. Even some interior features remained intact, which means what we see today is not just a reconstruction, it is the original structure, revealed after being hidden for thousands of years. And that changes how it is experienced, because walking through the site now doesn't feel like looking at ruins in the usual sense. It feels like entering a space that was paused. The rooms are still there. The passageways still connect. The arrangement still makes sense. Only the people are missing. And maybe that's the most striking part. Because the design still works, even now the logic of the space is clear. Movement flows naturally. The placement of features feels intentional. The structure still holds together in a way that suggests it was built with understanding, not guesswork. And that understanding is what remains. Not written, not recorded in language, but present in the stone itself. Because every wall, every passage, every repeated feature reflects a decision made by the people who built it. Decisions shaped by environment, by need, and by a way of thinking that we can still partially recognize, even if we don't fully share it. And that may be the reason Skara Brae stands out. Not because it is mysterious in the usual sense, but because it is clear. Clear enough to show how people lived, how they organized space, and how they adapted to their surroundings long before many of the structures we associate with ancient history were built. And at the same time, just distant enough to leave questions behind. Because even with everything preserved, there are still parts we don't fully understand. And those parts remain quiet. Embedded in the structure, waiting to be interpreted, as the settlement itself continues to sit at the edge of the sea, holding its shape, holding its layout, and holding a moment in time that has not completely disappeared. The ancient hilltop citadel. On a hill above the Danube River in southern Germany, there is a site that, at first glance, doesn't immediately reveal how unusual it is. The land rises gently, covered in grass, with wide views stretching across the surrounding valley. It feels open and quiet, like many other elevated landscapes in the region. But this hill was not left untouched. It was shaped, built upon, organized in a way that suggests far more than a simple settlement. This is Heineberg. And what makes it different is not just its position, but the scale of what once stood there. Because this was not a small village or an isolated structure. At its height, Heineberg functioned as a fortified center, a place where people gathered, traded, and lived within a system that extended beyond the hill itself. The outer defenses are the first clear indication. Walls once surrounded the settlement, not just as boundaries, but as deliberate constructions designed to define and protect the space. What remains today are traces of those fortifications, but evidence shows that they were once substantial, rising above the hill and visible from a distance. And then there is something unexpected. Part of the wall was not built using typical local methods. Instead of simple earth and timber, sections of the fortification were constructed using mud brick, a technique more commonly associated with Mediterranean cultures. That detail changes the context, because it suggests contact, not just local development, but interaction with distant regions, possibly through trade or cultural exchange. The presence of such construction methods indicates that Heineberg was not isolated, but connected to broader networks that extended far beyond what the landscape alone would suggest. And that raises a deeper question. What kind of place was this? Because hilltop settlements are common in many parts of Europe, often used for defense or refuge, but Honeberg appears to have been more structured than that. Inside the walls, there is evidence of organized space. Buildings arranged in patterns. Areas designated for specific uses. Open sections that suggest gathering or movement. This is not random placement. It reflects planning. And planning at this level implies authority, coordination, and a shared understanding of how the space should function, which suggests that Honeberg was more than a defensive position. It was a center, a place of importance. Archaeological evidence points to its connection with the early Celtic world, particularly during the Iron Age. Objects found at the site, including imported goods, indicate that it played a role in trade networks that link different regions. That means goods moved through here, ideas moved through here, people moved through here, and that changes how the site is understood. Because now it is not just a settlement on a hill, it is part of a system. And systems require structure. They require organization. They require stability, which brings the focus back to the walls. Because fortifications are not just about protection. They also define boundaries. They create separation. Inside and outside, and in places like this, that separation can carry meaning beyond defense. It can represent status, control, identity. And that idea is supported by the scale of the site, because Honeberg was not small. The central hilltop was surrounded by additional settlements, extending into the surrounding area. This suggests a larger community, with the hill acting as a focal point, a place where activity concentrated, where decisions may have been made, where structures were built to last. And then there's the timeline, because Honeberg reached its peak around the 6th century BCE, and then something changed. The site was eventually abandoned, not suddenly destroyed, not erased, but left behind. And that pattern appears again across different regions. Important places becoming quiet, structures remaining, but no longer used in the same way. And that creates a kind of distance, because we can see what was built. We can understand parts of how it functioned, but the exact reasons behind its rise and decline remain less clear. What remains is the structure of the place, the shape of the hill, the traces of walls, the layout that still suggests organization, even after centuries of change. And that creates a different kind of presence, because standing there now, the site does not feel empty in the usual sense. It feels defined, as if the structure is still there, even when parts of it are no longer visible. And maybe that's what makes places like Honeberg stand out, not because they are mysterious in an obvious way, but because they show something that is partially understood, a level of organization, a level of connection, that existed long before it was fully recorded, and that leaves a quiet question, not just about what was built, but about how much of that system is still hidden, because what we see today is only what remains, the visible parts, the parts that survived. And beyond that, there may have been more structures, more activity, more connections that no longer leave clear traces. And that is often the case with early centers like this. They don't disappear completely. They leave outlines, patterns, fragments of something larger. And those fragments are enough to suggest that Honeberg was not just a hilltop settlement. It was part of a developing world, a place where ideas, materials, and people came together, and where something structured, something organized, took shape long before it became common. And even now, the hill remains, quiet, elevated, still overlooking the land as it did thousands of years ago, holding the shape of a place that once mattered, even if its full story is no longer completely visible. The ancient rock-cut city. In eastern Georgia, not far from the banks of the Kura River, there is a landscape that at first appears ordinary. Rolling terrain, exposed rock, wind moving steadily across the surface. But as you move closer, the rock begins to change. Not in its composition, but in its shape. Openings appear, Smooth, rounded entrances cut directly into the stone, leading into spaces that are not natural caves, but something else entirely. This is Uplisike, a city carved into rock. And what makes it unusual is not just that it exists, but how completely it was formed within the landscape itself. Because this is not a single cave or a series of isolated chambers. It is a network, rooms connected to corridors, passages leading to larger halls, spaces arranged in a way that reflects structure rather than randomness. The stone here is soft enough to be shaped, but stable enough to hold its form over long periods of time. And that combination allowed something unusual to happen. Instead of building on the land, the builders removed material from it, carving inward, shaping space by subtraction rather than addition. And that creates a different kind of architecture. Because everything is part of the same mass. Walls, ceilings, floors, all continuous, not assembled but revealed. And that changes how the city is understood. Because construction here is not about placing materials together. It's about understanding what to remove, which requires planning. Because once stone is cut away, it cannot be replaced. Every decision is permanent. Every space must be considered before it is formed. And that suggests foresight, a mental layout of the structure before it exists physically. Which means the design begins before the first cut is made. And that brings the focus to the people who built it. Uplistika dates back to at least the early 1st millennium BCE, though parts of the site may be older. Over time, it developed into a significant center, with evidence of habitation, trade, and ritual activity. And the layout reflects that. There are large halls that may have been used for gatherings, smaller chambers that suggest storage or private use, passageways that connect different levels of the site. And then there are areas that appear to have had symbolic or ceremonial importance, spaces that are positioned differently, shaped with more care, set apart from the rest, which suggests that the city was not purely functional. It carried meaning, and that meaning was built into the rock itself, because carving something like this is not quick. It takes time. Effort repeated over years, possibly generations. And that means the site was not created all at once. It developed, expanded, adapted, which is visible in the variation between different sections. Some areas are more refined, others more basic, indicating changes over time, different phases of construction, different priorities. And that evolution reflects something important, because it shows that the city remained relevant, used, maintained, until something changed. Over time, Uplistika began to lose its importance. New centers emerged. Trade routes shifted. Political and cultural changes altered the region. And gradually, the city was abandoned. Not destroyed, but left behind. And that creates a different kind of preservation. Because the structure remains in place. The rooms are still there. The passages still connect. The layout still makes sense, even without the people who once used it. And that makes the experience of the site unusual. Because walking through it today doesn't feel like exploring ruins in the traditional sense. It feels like moving through a space that has been emptied. The architecture is intact. The structure is clear. But the activity is gone, and that creates a quiet kind of contrast. Because everything is still where it was meant to be. Only the purpose is no longer visible. And maybe that's what makes Uplisike different. Because it shows a way of building that is not based on adding materials, but on removing them, shaping space directly from the environment, integrating structure into the landscape so completely that the boundary between natural and built begins to disappear. And that idea appears in other places as well, rock-cut architecture in different regions, different time periods, but here it forms an entire city, not just isolated spaces, but a connected system. And that scale changes the perspective, because it suggests that this was not an experiment. It was established, understood, repeated. And that means the knowledge required to create it was not limited. It was shared, maintained, and then, eventually, left behind. What remains is the structure, the carved stone, the pathways, the spaces that still guide movement even now, and the sense that this place was once active in a way that is no longer fully visible, because the city is still there, not collapsed, not erased, but waiting, quietly holding its form. As the landscape around it continues to change, the early Nubian temple tower. In northern Sudan, near the banks of the Nile, there is a structure that rises from the flat landscape in a way that feels both simple and unusual at the same time. It doesn't have the sharp lines of stone temples. It doesn't carry the polished surfaces of later monuments. Instead, it appears almost like a solid mass, layered, weathered, built from mud brick. This is the Kerma Defufa. And at first it can be difficult to understand what it is. From a distance it looks like a large rectangular mound, shaped by time and erosion. The edges are softened, the surface uneven, and the color blends with the surrounding earth. But as you move closer, the structure becomes clearer. This is not natural. It was built. Carefully, deliberately, and at a scale that suggests importance. The Western Defufa, the largest of these structures, rises several meters above the ground, with thick walls and internal spaces that indicate it was more than just a platform. It was a building, possibly a temple. And that distinction matters, because temples are not built for daily life. They are built for meaning, for gathering, for rituals that connect people to something beyond immediate survival. And that changes how the structure is understood. Because constructing something like this from mud brick requires effort, not in the same way as cutting stone, but in repetition. Brick after brick, layer after layer, each one formed, dried, and placed with intention. And that process takes time. It requires organization, labor, planning. And that suggests a society capable of sustaining that effort, which brings the focus to Kerma itself. Because this was not an isolated structure. It was part of a larger city, one of the earliest urban centers in Nubia, dating back to around 2500 BCE. A place with its own identity, its own development, and its own systems that existed alongside, and sometimes in interaction with, ancient Egypt. And that context is important, because it shows that complex societies were not limited to a single region. They developed in multiple places, in different ways, using different materials. And here, the material was mud brick, a choice that reflects both environment and method. Stone was not as accessible in the same way, but earth was. And so the structure rises from the same material as the land itself, which creates a different kind of presence, because instead of standing apart from the environment, it blends with it, even as it rises above it. And that balance is part of what makes the Defufa unusual, because it is both visible and subtle at the same time. A structure that can be seen from a distance, but also feels connected to the ground it stands on. Inside, the spaces are narrow. Passages move through the interior. Rooms branch off, not large open halls, but contained areas, which suggests controlled movement, defined use, and possibly restricted access. Because not every space in a structure like this is meant for everyone. Some areas are central, others more limited. And that creates a hierarchy within the structure itself, which reflects a hierarchy in the society that built it. And then there's the scale of time, because the Defufa was not built in a single moment. It developed, expanded, modified over generations, which means its significance lasted. It remained important long enough to justify continued effort. And that suggests continuity, stability, a system that supported its existence. But eventually, like many ancient centers, Kerma declined. The reasons are not fully clear. Changes in power, shifts in trade, interactions with neighboring regions, all possible. And over time the city faded. But the Defufa remained, because structures like this are difficult to erase. Even as they weather, even as they soften, they hold their form, and that's what we see. today. Not a perfect monument, but a preserved outline, a structure that still rises from the ground, still marking a place that once held meaning. And maybe that's the most important part. Because while the details of its use are not fully known, the intention is still visible. It was built to stand, to be seen, to define a space within a larger system. And even now, thousands of years later, it continues to do that, quietly, without decoration, without explanation, just present, holding its shape, holding its place in the landscape, and holding a piece of a history that is not always as widely recognized, but no less significant. The ancient terrace complex. In the sacred valley of Peru, where the Andes rise sharply and the land shifts between steep slopes and narrow river paths, there is a site that doesn't just sit on the mountain, it reshapes it. Stone terraces climb the hillside in long, precise lines, cutting across the natural slope in a way that feels controlled rather than adapted. From a distance, they appear almost like steps carved into the mountain, each level defined, each edge straight, forming a pattern that repeats upward. This is Ollantaytambo. At first, the terraces seem practical. They follow the contours of the land, creating flat surfaces where there would otherwise be none. In a region where space is limited and the terrain is uneven, this kind of construction makes sense. But the more you look at them, the more the simplicity begins to shift. Because these are not just functional platforms, they are precise. Each terrace is supported by carefully fitted stone walls, built from large blocks that are shaped to sit together without visible gaps. The surfaces are aligned, the angles consistent, and the structure holds its form even after centuries of exposure. And that level of consistency suggests something more than basic construction. It suggests planning, not just of individual sections, but of the entire slope, because the terraces are not random additions. They are part of a larger design, one that considers water, stability, and movement across the landscape, and water is a key part of this system. Channels run through the site, directing flow from higher elevations down through the terraces. This controls erosion, distributes moisture, and prevents the structure from weakening over time. Which means the builders understood something important. Not just how to shape stone, but how to manage the environment around it. And that combination changes how the site is understood. Because now it's not just architecture, it's engineering, integrated directly into the landscape. And then there's the upper section of the site. Above the terraces, larger stone structures appear, built from massive blocks that are far heavier than those used below. Some of these stones are enormous, positioned with precision, forming walls that seem almost out of proportion with the rest of the construction. And that contrast raises a question, because the terraces below are consistent, controlled, and uniform, but the structures above feel different, larger, more complex, as if they were built with a different priority, or at a different time. Some researchers suggest that parts of Ollantaytambo were left unfinished. Evidence of partially shaped stones and incomplete sections supports this idea. It appears that construction may have stopped suddenly, leaving behind elements that were never fully completed. And that creates a sense of interruption, because the site feels both complete and incomplete at the same time. The terraces function. The lower structures are stable, but the upper sections suggest something that was meant to go further. And then there's the question of movement, because transporting stone in a place like this is not simple. The terrain is steep, the paths are narrow, and yet large blocks were brought here, shaped, and placed with accuracy, which requires coordination, effort repeated many times, and a system that supports that kind of work. And that brings the focus back to the people who built it. Ollantaytambo is associated with the Inca civilization, a society known for its ability to work with stone and adapt to difficult environments. And that knowledge is visible here, in the alignment of the terraces, in the integration of water systems, in the stability of the construction, even after centuries of weather and seismic activity, because this region is not stable. Earthquakes occur, the ground shifts, and yet the terraces remain, which suggests flexibility, a design that allows movement without collapse. And that's not accidental. It reflects understanding, not just of material, but of force. And then there's the broader context, because Ollantaytambo is not isolated. It is part of a network of sites across the Andes, connected by roads and shared techniques, which means the knowledge used here was not limited to a single place. It was part of a larger system, and that system allowed for construction at a scale that feels difficult to achieve even now. And yet, like many ancient sites, there is a point where the activity stops, the site changes, its role shifts, and what remains is the structure. The terraces still hold the mountain, the channels still guide water. The stones remain in place, even where construction appears unfinished. And that creates a quiet kind of contrast, because the system still works, even without the people who built it. And maybe that's what makes Ollantaytambo stand out, because it doesn't just show what was built, it shows how it was built to last, integrated into the landscape, responsive to the environment, and stable enough to remain long after its original purpose has changed. And even now, standing at the base of those terraces, looking upward as they rise along the mountain, the pattern is still clear. Not random, not improvised, but designed, step by step, layer by layer, until the mountain itself became part of the structure. The Adobe Megacity. On the northern coast of Peru, where the desert meets the Pacific Ocean, there is a place where the ground itself seems to have been shaped into a city. Not built upward with stone, not carved into mountains, but formed from earth. This is Chan Chan. And at first, it doesn't look like a city in the usual sense. From a distance, it blends into the landscape, its color nearly identical to the surrounding sand. The walls don't stand out sharply. The edges feel softened, as if the entire structure is part of the desert itself. But as you move closer, the scale begins to emerge. Walls rise, long, continuous, stretching across large sections of land. Enclosures appear, defined spaces, corridors. And suddenly, what seemed like open ground becomes organized, structured, deliberate. Because Chan Chan is not a small settlement. It is the largest adobe city ever built, covering an area that once held tens of thousands of people, arranged into a network of compounds, each with its own layout, its own internal organization, and its own purpose. And that changes everything. Because building at this scale using adobe is not simple. Adobe is not stone. It does not resist time in the same way. It requires maintenance. It requires renewal. And that means the city was not just constructed, it was sustained, continuously, which suggests a system. Because maintaining walls of this size across such a large area requires coordination, labor, and organization over long periods of time. And that points to something structured, a society with hierarchy, with planning, with the ability to manage resources and people at a large scale. Chan Chan was the capital of the Shimu civilization, a culture that developed along the Peruvian coast before the rise of the Inca. And within this city, the layout reflects that structure. Large rectangular compounds, often referred to as citadels, are enclosed by high walls separating them from the surrounding space. Inside there are courtyards, rooms, storage areas, and something else. Decoration. The walls are not plain. They are patterned, carved with repeating designs, waves, geometric shapes, figures that reflect the environment, particularly the sea. Because for the Chemu, the ocean was central, a source of life, a source of identity. And that influence is visible in the city itself, which suggests that Chan Chan was not only functional, it was symbolic, a reflection of the world the people understood. And then there's the structure of the compounds. They are not all the same. Some are larger, more complex, with multiple sections. Others are smaller, simpler. And that difference suggests hierarchy. Not everyone lived in the same kind of space. Not everyone had the same access, which reflects a layered society, organized, defined. And then there's the question of water. Because this is a desert. Dry, limited in resources, and yet a city of this size existed here, which means water had to be managed carefully. Systems of canals brought water from rivers further inland, allowing agriculture to support the population. And that adds another layer of complexity, because now the city is not just architecture, it is infrastructure, a system that connects environment, resources, and population. And that system worked for centuries, until something changed. Around the late 15th century, the Chimu were conquered by the Inca Empire, and with that, the role of Chan Chan shifted. It no longer functioned as an independent center, and over time the city was abandoned, left to the elements. And adobe, unlike stone, does not resist time easily. Wind erodes it, rain weakens it, the walls begin to soften, edges lose their sharpness, and the city slowly blends back into the desert. But not completely, because the structure remains. The layout is still visible, the compound still defined, though patterns still present, even if faded. And that creates a different kind of preservation. Because instead of standing as a rigid monument, Chan Chan feels like something that is slowly returning to the ground it came from. And maybe that's part of its identity, because it was built from the earth. And over time, it becomes part of it again. But even in that state, the scale is still clear. The organization is still visible. The intention is still there. And that's what makes it stand out. Because despite the material, despite the erosion, despite the passage of time, the structure still communicates something. A system. A city. A place where thousands of people lived within a design that was not random but carefully arranged. And even now, walking through the remains, the space still guides movement. The walls still define paths, the enclosures still create separation, and the sense of structure remains, even without the people who once filled it. And that may be the most important part, because Chan Chan shows that complexity does not always require permanence. It can exist in materials that change, in forms that shift, and still leave behind enough to be understood, even centuries later. As the desert continues to move, and the city slowly settles back into the land, still holding the shape of something that was once vast and carefully built, the pyramid with niches. In the tropical lowlands of eastern Mexico, where dense vegetation meets open clearings shaped by time and human activity, there is a structure that doesn't immediately resemble the pyramids most people expect. It rises in steps, as many ancient structures do, but something about its surface feels different, more detailed, more deliberate. This is El Tajin. And at the center of the site stands a pyramid that draws attention not because of its size alone, but because of the way it has been shaped. The pyramid of the niches. At first, the structure appears geometric and controlled, built from stone in layered tiers that rise steadily upward. But as you look closer, the surface begins to reveal a pattern that repeats across the entire facade. Recessed openings. Small, evenly spaced niches carved into the walls. Hundreds of them. Each one framed, aligned, and positioned with consistency. And that repetition changes how the structure is perceived. Because this is not just a pyramid. It is a surface designed to hold a pattern. And that pattern feels intentional. Not decorative in a random sense, but structured in a way that suggests meaning. The number of niches is often noted as 365, and that detail has led to a common interpretation, that the pyramid may function as a kind of calendar, a physical representation of the solar year. And while that idea is not confirmed with absolute certainty, it aligns with something broader. Because many ancient cultures observed the movement of the sun and incorporated those observations into their architecture, marking time, tracking cycles, creating structures that reflect patterns in the sky. And here, that idea appears in a different form, not through alignment alone, but through repetition, through number. And that shifts the focus from orientation to structure itself, because the meaning is built into the surface, each niche contributing to a larger count, a system that can be seen, not just calculated. And that suggests awareness, not only of time, but of how to represent it physically. And then there's the design itself. The niches are not simple openings. They are framed by projecting stones, creating shadow and depth that changes depending on the position of the sun. As light moves across the surface, the pattern shifts. Some niches appear darker, others lighter. And that creates movement, even though the structure itself is still, which adds another layer to the experience, because now the pyramid is not just a static form. It interacts with light. It changes subtly throughout the day, and that interaction may have been part of its purpose, not just to exist, but to respond. And then there's the broader site, because El Tajin was not a single structure. It was a city, with multiple buildings, plazas, and spaces that suggest organization and activity at a larger scale. Ball courts, platforms, ball courts, open areas that indicate gathering and movement, which means the pyramid was part of a system, not isolated, but integrated into a larger layout. And that context matters, because it suggests that whatever meaning the pyramid held, it was connected to the people who lived there, to their routines, to their understanding of time and space. And then there's the question of who built it. The exact culture associated with El Tajin is not fully clear, but it is often linked to the classic Veracruz culture, active between roughly 600 and 1200 CE. And during that time, the city appears to have been a major center, active, developed. And then, like many ancient sites, it declined. The reasons are not fully understood. Environmental changes, shifts in power, possible conflict, all suggested, but not fully resolved. And over time, the city was abandoned. The vegetation returned. The structures were covered, and the pyramid remained, holding its form beneath layers of growth, until it was uncovered again. And now, standing in front of it, the pattern is still clear. The niches remain. The structure still rises. And the design still feels deliberate, even after centuries. And maybe that's the most important part, because whatever meaning was built into this structure, it has not completely disappeared. It is still visible, still present in the repetition, in the number, in the way the surface interacts with light. And even if the exact purpose is no longer fully known, the intention is still there, embedded in the design, held within the structure, and continuing to suggest that this was not just a building, but a system, a way of marking something, tracking something, or representing something that mattered enough to be built into stone. And even now, as the sun moves across its surface, the pattern remains, quiet, consistent, and still difficult to ignore. The ancient hill settlement. In the lowlands of eastern Scotland, rising above the surrounding fields, there is a hill that stands out not because of its height alone, but because of its shape. Steep on one side, broad on the other. From a distance, it feels like a natural landmark, a place that has always been there. But this hill holds something more. This is trap rain law. And what makes it significant is not immediately visible from the ground. At first, it appears quiet, open, almost untouched. But this was once a place of activity, a settlement, a center. And over time, that becomes clear through what remains. The surface of the hill shows traces of occupation. Stone fragments, foundations, subtle changes in the terrain that suggest structures once stood here. Not large monuments, not towering walls, but enough to indicate presence. And that presence extends across centuries. because trap rain law was not used for a single period. It was occupied, repeatedly, from the Iron Age through the early historic period, which means the hill remained important, long enough for different groups to return to it, to build, to use, and to adapt it to their needs. And that continuity suggests something about its location, because from the top, the view is extensive. The surrounding land opens in every direction. Fields, rivers, distant hills. And that kind of visibility is not accidental in settlements like this. It provides awareness, control, the ability to see movement across the landscape, which makes it valuable, not just as a place to live, but as a place to watch. And that brings the focus to its role, because hilltop settlements are often associated with defense. And while there is evidence of fortification here, it is not as pronounced as in some other sites. The defenses are present, but not dominant, which suggests that the function of the site may have been broader, not just protection, but occupation, a place where people lived, worked, interacted, and that idea is supported by what was found here. One of the most notable discoveries at Trapprin Law was a large hoard of Roman silver, objects that had been cut and broken, possibly for reuse or redistribution. And that detail changes the context, because it suggests connection, not isolation, interaction with the Roman world, trade, exchange, or possibly conflict followed by acquisition. And that places the site within a larger network, because it was not separate from surrounding regions. It was part of them, engaged with them, influenced by them, and that adds complexity to its identity. Because now it is not just a local settlement, it is a point of contact between different cultures, different systems, and that interaction likely shaped how the site developed over time, because settlements that are connected tend to change. They adapt, they incorporate new elements, and they evolve, which is visible here, through the layers of occupation, through the changes in structure, through the evidence that different periods left behind. And then, eventually, that continuity ends. The site is no longer used in the same way. Activity declines, and the hill returns to a quieter state, but not entirely empty. Because what remains is still there, the shape of the settlement, the traces of structure, the evidence of long-term use, and that creates a different kind of presence. Because even without standing walls or visible buildings, the site still feels defined, as if the structure is still there, just no longer visible in the same way. And maybe that's what makes Trapprin Law different, because it doesn't rely on large, preserved architecture to communicate its past. Instead, it holds that information in fragments, in traces, in patterns that suggest what once existed without fully showing it. And that requires a different kind of understanding, because the story is not immediately visible, it has to be reconstructed. From what remains, from what was found, from how the landscape itself has been shaped. And that process leaves space for interpretation, for questions that are not fully resolved, but still grounded in what is there. And what is there is enough to suggest that this hill was not just a feature of the landscape. It was part of a system, a place where people gathered, where they built, where they connected with a wider world, and where that activity continued long enough to leave a mark, even if that mark is now subtle. And as the hill stands today, rising above the surrounding land, it still carries that presence. Quiet, unobtrusive, but holding the outline of something that once mattered, even if its full form is no longer completely visible. The Fire Temple base, in the southeastern region of modern-day Iran, in a landscape shaped by dry plains and shifting wind, there are the remains of a settlement that once held a level of complexity not immediately visible at first glance. The ground appears quiet, low structures, faded outlines. But beneath that stillness lies something older. This is Shar-e-Sukta, often referred to as the Burnt City, and within this site there are foundations that suggest something more than simple habitation. Among them, a structure believed to be a temple base. At first, it doesn't stand out as a monument. There are no towering walls, no preserved columns. What remains is lower, subtle, defined by its layout rather than its height. And that's where the detail begins to matter, because the base shows signs of deliberate construction. Layers of material arranged to create a stable platform, sections that suggest division of space, not random, but planned. And that raises the first question: what stood here? Because a base like this implies something above it, a structure that no longer remains, lost to time, eroded, or dismantled. And that absence creates a gap, because without the upper structure, interpretation becomes more difficult. We are left with the foundation and the shape of what might have been. Some researchers suggest that this area functioned as a religious space, a temple, possibly associated with early forms of ritual involving fire. And that idea connects to something broader, because fire has held symbolic importance across many ancient cultures, not just as a source of heat or light, but as something more, a presence, a focal point. And in structured spaces, fire is often placed deliberately, contained, central, which would align with the idea of a constructed platform, a place designed to hold something significant. But the evidence is not complete. There are no clear remains of altars, no preserved features that confirm exactly how the space was used, and so the interpretation remains open, because the base suggests importance, but does not fully explain it. And that creates a quiet kind of uncertainty. Because we can see the structure, we can understand that it was built with intention, but the meaning behind it is only partially visible, and that is often the case with early sites like this. They preserve form, but not always function. And then there's the broader context of Shahr Sukhteh itself, because this was not a small settlement. At its height, it was a large and complex city, active around 3000 BCE, with evidence of advanced craftsmanship, trade, organized living spaces, and even early examples of specialized activity, including what appears to be early forms of medical and artistic development, which suggests a society that was not only established, but evolving. And within that kind of environment, spaces set apart for specific purposes become more likely. Places that are not part of daily living, but part of something else, something structured, something symbolic. And that brings the focus back to the base, because even without the upper structure, the design still communicates something. It defines a space, separates it from the surrounding area, elevates it even slightly. And that elevation matters, because raising a structure, even by a small amount, changes how it is perceived. It becomes distinct, noticeable, important. And that suggests intention beyond practicality. And then there's the passage of time, because Shahri Sukta did not remain active indefinitely. At some point it was abandoned. The reasons are not fully understood. Environmental changes, resource shifts, possibly internal factors, all considered, but not fully resolved. And over time the structures weakened. The upper layers disappeared, leaving behind what we see now. The foundation, the outline, the base of something that once stood above it. And that creates a different kind of presence, because instead of a complete structure, we are left with a starting point, a beginning without a full ending. And that requires interpretation, because the base tells us that something was built, but not exactly what, and not exactly how it was used, only that it mattered enough to be constructed with care, and that care remains visible in the layout, in the placement, in the fact that it still holds its form after thousands of years. And maybe that's the most important detail, because even without the upper structure, the intention is still there, embedded in the ground, defined by the base, and continuing to suggest that this was not just another part of the settlement, but something set apart, something built with purpose, even if that purpose is no longer fully clear. And as the site remains quiet beneath the open sky, the structure still holds its place, not complete, but not gone, still marking the location of something that once existed, and something we are still trying to understand. The ancient cliff dwellings. In the central region of Mali, where the land suddenly breaks into a long escarpment stretching across the horizon, there is a place where the rock face itself becomes part of human habitation. The cliffs rise sharply, forming a natural wall that separates the plateau above from the plains below. From a distance, they appear solid and unbroken, shaped only by time and erosion. But as you move closer, details begin to emerge. Openings, structures, forms that are not natural. This is the Bandiagara escarpment. And built into these cliffs are dwellings that seem almost suspended between earth and sky. They are not placed at ground level. They are embedded into the rock itself, positioned high above the base of the cliff in locations that are difficult to reach even today. At first, it feels like an adaptation to the environment, using the cliff as protection, using height as advantage. But the more you observe them, the more questions begin to form. Because these structures are not random, they are shaped, constructed from mud and stone, forming small enclosures, storage spaces, and what appear to be burial sites. The surfaces are smooth in places, defined in others, suggesting careful work rather than quick assembly. And that raises the first question, why here? Because building at this height is not simple. Materials must be carried upward. Movement is limited. Access is restricted. And yet, these structures exist in large numbers, spread along the cliff in a way that suggests repetition rather than isolated effort. Which means this was not a single attempt. It was a pattern. And patterns like this suggest purpose. The site is most closely associated with the Dogon people who have lived in this region for centuries. But the highest and most inaccessible structures are believed to be older, possibly built by an earlier group often referred to as the Telem. And that distinction matters, because it suggests continuity, different groups using the same landscape, adapting it in different ways, and leaving traces of their presence in layers. The Dogon settlements are generally lower, closer to accessible areas, while the older structures remain higher up in positions that are more difficult to explain. And that creates a contrast, because it suggests a change in how the space was used, or a change in necessity. Some interpretations suggest that the higher dwellings were used for burial, placing the dead in elevated positions, away from the ground, possibly as a form of protection or symbolic placement. Others suggest defensive reasons, using height to avoid threats, creating spaces that are difficult to reach, and both explanations are possible, because the environment supports them. The cliffs provide natural defense, they provide separation, and they provide visibility. From these heights, the surrounding land can be seen clearly, movement across the plains, visible from a distance. And that awareness can be valuable. But even with these explanations, there are still details that remain unclear, because the positioning of some structures seems extreme, placed in locations that require effort beyond what seems necessary. And that raises the possibility that the purpose was not purely practical, that there may have been symbolic or cultural reasons that are not fully understood today. And that is often the case with sites like this, because they preserve form, but not always meaning. And then there's the experience of the place itself. Walking along the base of the cliffs, the scale becomes clear. The rock rises above. The structures appear small against it. And yet their placement makes them stand out, because they are not part of the natural formation. They interrupt it, subtly, but clearly. And that creates a sense of integration, not complete separation, but not complete blending either. A balance between natural and built. And that balance is what defines the site, because the cliffs are not altered completely. They are used, adapted, incorporated into the way people lived and interacted with the environment. And that approach reflects understanding, not just of construction, but of landscape, knowing where to build, how to use what is already there, how to create space without reshaping everything. And that knowledge develops over time, through experience, through observation, through generations of interaction with the same environment. And that continuity is visible here, in the layers of occupation, in the differences between older and newer structures, and in the fact that the site remained important for so long, but eventually, like many places, its role changes. Some areas are no longer used. Structures remain, but activity shifts, and what is left behind becomes part of the landscape. And that creates a quiet kind of presence, because the Yeo dwellings are still there, high in the cliffs, unchanged in position, still holding their form, even as the people who built them are no longer present. And maybe that's what makes the Bandiagara escarpment stand out, because it shows a way of living that is directly tied to the environment, not imposed on it, but shaped by it, and in that relationship something lasting was created, not in massive structures or monumental scale, but in placement, in position, in the decision to build where it seems most difficult, and to make that space usable, even if the full reason behind it is no longer completely clear. And as the cliffs continue to stand, stretching across the horizon, the dwellings remain, quiet, elevated, and still marking the presence of something that once existed there, between the rock and the sky. The prehistoric stone circles. Across parts of Senegal and the Gambia, where the land stretches wide under open sky, there are formations that don't rise like monuments or blend like ruins. They stand in patterns. From the ground, they appear simple, rows of upright stones, weathered, evenly spaced. But from above, the design becomes clearer. Circles, repeated across the landscape, organized, deliberate. This is known as the Senegambian stone circles. And what makes them unusual is not just their presence, but their consistency. Across hundreds of kilometers, these circles appear again and again, following similar patterns, similar spacing, similar structure, which suggests something important, because repetition at this scale is not accidental. It reflects a shared system, a method, an understanding that extends beyond a single location, and that immediately raises a question. What were they built for? Because each circle is made from carefully placed stones, often carved from laterite, a material found in the region. The stones are shaped into pillars, some standing over 2 meters tall, and arranged to form circular enclosures. At the center of some of these circles, there are additional features. Burials, remains that suggest these sites were used as funerary spaces. And that provides one of the clearest interpretations, that these circles are connected to ritual, to burial practices, to the marking of individuals or groups within a structured space. But even with that understanding, there are details that remain, because the arrangement is too consistent, too deliberate, to be only functional. The spacing between stones is controlled, the circular form maintained, the orientation often aligned in ways that are not immediately explained, and that suggests something beyond simple placement. Because building a circle requires planning. You need a center. You need equal distance. You need coordination. And when that process is repeated across a wide region, it implies communication, shared knowledge, a system that connects different groups, and that's what makes this site different. Because it is not a single location. It is a network, a landscape shaped by repeated patterns. And that raises another thought. Because these circles were not built all at once. They were created over time, generations, possibly centuries. And yet, the pattern remains consistent, which suggests continuity. A tradition that was maintained, passed down, repeated with enough accuracy to preserve the overall design. And that requires more than memory. It requires structure, understanding of how the pattern is formed and why it matters. Then there's the experience of the site itself. Standing among the stones, the scale feels different than expected. They are not massive in the way of large monuments, but they are present, each one upright, each one placed, and together they define space, an area that feels enclosed without being closed. Open to the sky, but clearly marked. And that kind of space changes how it is used, because it becomes a place set apart, not part of everyday movement, but something distinct, something recognized. And that distinction is often linked to ritual, to moments that are not part of daily life, but part of something else, something symbolic. And then there's the passage of time, because these stones have remained in place for centuries, exposed to weather, to erosion, to change. And yet, many of them still stand, still forming the same circles, still holding the same positions, which means the construction was stable, accurate enough to endure. And that reflects knowledge, not just of placement, but of material, of how to shape it, how to position it, so that it remains. And that brings the focus back to the builders. Because while we can see the structures, the people themselves are less visible in the record. Their identities are not fully defined, their systems not fully preserved, but their actions remain, in the stones, in the patterns, in the repetition across the landscape, and that creates a different kind of understanding. Because instead of a single narrative, we see a system, one that is not fully explained, but clearly intentional. And maybe that's what makes the Senegambian circles stand out. Because they are not isolated, they are connected, part of something larger. And that larger system is still only partially understood. Not because it is invisible, but because it is spread out, distributed across space and across time. And even now the circles remain, quiet, evenly spaced, holding their form, and continuing to mark a pattern that was placed into the landscape long ago. A pattern that still exists, even if its full meaning is no longer completely clear. The prehistoric stone village in the desert. In the arid landscape of Gujarat, on an island-like stretch within the Rann of Kutch, there is a site that doesn't immediately reveal how advanced it once was. The ground is dry, flat, quiet under the open sky. At first it feels empty, but beneath that stillness, there is structure. This is Dolavira, and unlike many ancient settlements that rely on mud brick or organic materials, this one is built largely from stone. That alone sets it apart. Because stone construction in this region at this time was not the most common choice. And yet, here it is used with consistency. Walls, boundaries, defined sections of space, and that's where the layout begins to matter. Because Dolavira is not random, it is divided, clearly, into different zones, a citadel, a town, a lower town, each section separated by walls, each with its own internal organization, creating a structure that reflects planning at a large scale. And that kind of division suggests something important, because it implies hierarchy, control, an understanding of how space should be used and who it is for. Which means this was not just a settlement, it was a system. Dolavira was part of the Indus Valley civilization, dating back to around 3000 BCE, a civilization known for its urban planning, standardized construction, and early forms of organized infrastructure. And all of that is visible here. But what makes Dolavira particularly unusual is how it deals with water, because this is a desert. Rain is limited. Resources are not constant. And yet, the site contains an extensive system of reservoirs. Large, carefully constructed basins designed to collect and store water. Some are cut into the ground. Others are lined with stone, all positioned to capture seasonal flows. And that changes everything. Because now the settlement is not just adapting to the environment, it is controlling it, managing scarcity, turning limited resources into something sustainable. And that requires knowledge. Not just of construction, but of timing. Of how water moves, when it arrives, how long it lasts, and how to preserve it. And that level of understanding suggests observation over long periods. Patterns recognized. systems developed, and then implemented in a way that supports an entire population. And that population was not small. At its height, Dolavira supported a significant number of people, all living within a layout that reflects organization and planning. Streets align. Structures are positioned with intention. Movement through the site is guided by its design. And that consistency is not accidental. It reflects a shared system, a way of building that was understood and repeated. And then there's something else. Near one of the entrances, there is evidence of a large signboard. Not fully preserved, but enough remains to suggest that symbols were displayed prominently. And that raises another layer, because now there is communication, not just through structure, but through written or symbolic representation, which suggests identity, recognition, a way of marking the place. And that connects to something broader within the Indus civilization. Because their script remains undeciphered, we can see the symbols, but we do not fully understand them. And that leaves part of the story incomplete. Because while the structure is clear, the meaning behind it is only partially visible. And then there's the question of change. Because like many ancient sites, Dolavira did not remain active indefinitely. At some point, the system begins to weaken. Environmental shifts, changes in water availability, possible disruptions to the broader network, all contribute. And gradually the settlement is abandoned. Not destroyed, not erased, but left behind, and over time the desert reclaims the space. The structures remain, but the activity disappears. And that creates a different kind of preservation. Because stone lasts, the walls still stand, the reservoirs still hold their shape, the layout is still visible, even after thousands of years. And that allows us to see something clearly. Not just that people lived here, but how they lived. How they organized space, how they responded to their environment, and how they built systems that could sustain them. And maybe that's what makes Dolavira stand out. Because it shows complexity without relying on monumental scale. It shows planning, integration, understanding, all expressed through structure. And even now, walking through the site, the design still makes sense. The divisions are clear. The pathways still guide movement. The reservoirs still define the landscape. And the system is still visible, even without the people who once maintained it. And that leaves a quiet realization. Because this was not temporary. It was established, functional, sustained over time. And then, like many systems, it reached a point where it could no longer continue. But what remains is enough to show that something advanced existed here, something organized, something that understood how to live in a place where resources were limited, and still build something lasting. And as the desert continues to stretch around it, Dolavira remains, structured, defined, and still holding the outline of a system that once worked. The massive stone fort on a mountain ridge. In the desert of southern Israel, where the landscape stretches in dry, open silence, there is a plateau that rises sharply above the surrounding terrain. From a distance, it looks isolated, almost cut off. A flat-top mountain, steep on all sides, difficult to approach. This is Masada. And its position alone tells part of the story. Because building here is not convenient. It is not easy. It is deliberate. The top of the plateau forms a wide, level surface, separated from the desert below by sheer cliffs that make access limited and controlled. Even today, reaching the summit requires effort, following narrow paths that wind upward along the rock. And that isolation becomes the foundation of its purpose. Because Masada was not just a settlement, it was a fortress. At its height, it was developed under Herod the Great, a ruler known for large-scale construction and strategic planning. On this plateau, he created a complexity that included walls, storage facilities, living quarters, and defensive structures designed to hold against attack. And the layout reflects that. Walls trace the edges of the plateau, forming a perimeter that follows the natural shape of the land. Towers are positioned along these edges, creating points of observation and defense. Inside, the space is organized. Structures are placed with intention. Paths connect different areas. Movement is controlled. And that suggests planning at a level that goes beyond simple construction. Because everything here serves a purpose. And then there's the question of resources. Because this is a desert. Water is scarce, supplies are limited, and yet, Masada was designed to sustain people for extended periods. Large storage rooms were built to hold food. Cisterns were carved into the rock to collect and store water from seasonal rains, capturing runoff and preserving it for later use. And that system required understanding, not just of construction, but of environment, of how to take what is limited and make it last. And that changes how the site is understood. Because now it is not just a defensive position, it is a self-contained system, capable of functioning independently, even in isolation. And that isolation becomes central to its history, because Masada is often associated with a specific moment. A siege. During the 1st century CE, a group of rebels took refuge here, holding the fortress against Roman forces. The Romans surrounded the plateau, cut off access, and began the process of siege. And that process was not quick, because the natural defenses of Masada made direct assault difficult. So instead, the Romans built a ramp, a massive incline of earth and stone constructed along one side of the plateau, gradually rising until it reached the level of the fortress walls. And that detail is significant, because it shows that even the strongest natural defenses can be overcome with enough effort and coordination, and eventually the Romans reached the top. And the story that follows is often told as one of final resistance. But beyond the narrative, the structure itself remains, because even after the events that took place here, Masada was not erased. The walls still stand. The layout is still visible. The systems designed to sustain life are still present. And that allows us to see something clearly. Not just what happened here, but how it was built. Because the fortress reflects a level of planning that integrates location, structure, and resources into a single system. The mountain provides defense, the walls reinforce it. The storage and water systems make it sustainable, and together they create something that is more than just a place. They create a strategy, built into the landscape itself. And maybe that's what makes Masada stand out, because it shows how environment can be used as part of construction, not just as a setting, but as a component. The cliffs are part of the defense, the plateau is part of the design, and the isolation is part of the function. And even now, standing at the top looking out across the desert, the scale of that design becomes clear. The distance, the elevation, the separation from everything below, and the sense that this place was meant to hold, to resist, to remain. And in many ways, it has. Because while the people are gone, the structure is still there, defined, visible, and still shaped by the same choices that were made when it was first built. Choices based on understanding, on control, on the idea that a place like this could be turned into something more than a natural formation. Something structured, something defensive, something designed to last, and even now, as the desert stretches endlessly around it, Masada remains, elevated, isolated, and still holding the form of a fortress built on the edge of the landscape. The megalithic tomb with the giant capstone. In the limestone landscape of Western Ireland, where the ground stretches in pale gray slabs broken by cracks and low vegetation, there is a structure that seems almost too simple to carry meaning. It stands alone, stone, balanced, uncovered. This is the Polnabrone dolmen. And at first it doesn't appear complex. 2 upright stones, a single massive capstone resting across them. That's all. No walls, no enclosure, nothing that suggests a large construction. But the simplicity is what makes it stand out. Because this is not a natural formation, the stones are placed deliberately. And the capstone is enormous, far heavier than it appears at a distance, balanced in a way that suggests control rather than coincidence. And that immediately raises a question. How was it positioned? Because lifting a stone of that size requires coordination, effort, a method, even if the tools were simple. And that means this structure was not casual, it was planned, constructed with intention. The dolmen dates back to around 3000 BCE, placing it firmly in the Neolithic period. And during that time, structures like this appear across different regions, often associated with burial. And that is the case here. Excavations at Polnebron revealed human remains beneath the capstone, along with objects that suggest ritual or symbolic placement. Which means this was not just a marker, it was a tomb, a place connected to death, and possibly to memory. And that changes how the structure is understood, because now the simplicity becomes meaningful. The open design, the exposed stone, the position within the landscape, all of it suggests that this was not meant to be hidden, but seen, recognized. And that visibility matters. Because placing a tomb in an open environment like this creates a connection between the structure and the surrounding land. It becomes part of the landscape, not separated from it. And that idea appears in other megalithic structures as well, where placement is as important as construction, where location carries meaning. And here, the location is striking. The Burren is not fertile land, it is rocky, uneven, challenging. And yet, this structure stands here, which suggests that the choice of location was deliberate, not based on convenience, but on significance. And that raises another question. What did this place represent to the people who built it? Because selecting a site like this implies understanding, not just of construction, but of landscape, of how space is perceived, and how meaning can be attached to a location. And then there's the structure itself, because despite its simplicity, the proportions are balanced. The capstone is angled slightly, the uprights support it with stability, and the entire structure has remained in place for thousands of years, exposed to weather, to wind, to change. And yet, it stands, which suggests that whatever method was used to build it, it was effective. And that effectiveness is part of what makes megalithic structures so striking, because they rely on basic elements: stone, placement, balance. And yet, they endure, without mortar, without complex reinforcement. And that endurance creates presence, because the structure does not disappear. It remains. And over time it becomes part of the landscape itself, recognized, repeated in memory, and associated with something beyond its physical form. And maybe that's the key, because structures like this are not just about function. They are about meaning, about marking something that cannot be seen directly, about creating a place where memory is fixed into the ground. And that idea remains even now, because standing near the dolmen, the structure feels intentional, not large, not complex, but placed in a way that draws attention. And that attention is not accidental. It is part of the design, because the structure does not hide, it stands open, exposed, visible from a distance. And that visibility continues to carry meaning, even if the original purpose is no longer fully understood. And as the landscape around it remains quiet, the dolmen continues to stand, balanced, stable, and still holding the shape of something that was built thousands of years ago, with intention, and with a purpose that even now is only partially understood. The stone terrace is built into mountains, high in the sacred valley of Peru, surrounded by mountains that rise sharply against the sky. There is a place where the land doesn't just slope or level out. It drops, perfectly, in circles. At first, it doesn't look natural. The ground forms a series of concentric terraces that descend inward like a series of steps carved into the earth. Each level is defined, evenly spaced, and connected in a way that feels controlled rather than accidental. This is moray. And what makes it unusual is not just the shape, but the precision of that shape, because these are not irregular terraces following the mountain. They are circular, layered, symmetrical enough to suggest planning from the beginning. And that changes how the site is understood, because building in a circle at this scale requires control. You need a center. You need consistent distance. You need alignment across every level, and maintaining that across a descending structure is not simple, which means this was not improvised. It was designed. The terraces themselves are supported by stone walls, carefully constructed to hold the soil in place. Each level creates a flat surface, allowing for controlled use of the land, while also stabilizing the entire structure against erosion. And then there's something else. The environment changes as you move downward. The temperature shifts, the air feels different, and that variation is not small. Measurements have shown that there can be a noticeable difference between the top and the bottom of the terraces. And that detail leads to one of the most widely discussed interpretations: that Moray may have been used as an agricultural testing site, a place where different crops could be grown under slightly different conditions, testing how they respond, adapting them, selecting what works best. And in a region where agriculture depends heavily on environment, that kind of system would be valuable because it allows for control, experimentation, understanding how to work with the land rather than against it. And that aligns with what is known about the Inca civilization, a culture that developed methods to farm in difficult terrain, adapting to altitude, climate, and limited space with a level of precision that is still studied today. But even with that explanation, there are still questions, because the scale of Moray is significant, and the effort required to create these terraces goes beyond what is necessary for simple farming. The symmetry, the depth, the consistency of the structure all suggest something more deliberate, possibly ceremonial, possibly symbolic, or possibly a combination of both function and meaning. And that dual purpose appears in many ancient sites, where structures are not limited to a single use. They serve practical needs, while also representing something else, something tied to identity, to understanding, to the I-see relationship between people and their environment. And then there's the experience of the site itself. Standing at the edge, looking down into the terraces, the depth becomes clear. The circles draw the eye inward, layer after layer, until the center. And that movement feels intentional, because the design guides perception. It directs attention. It creates a sense of focus. And that is not something that happens by accident. It is part of the structure. And that suggests awareness not just of construction, but of experience, of how a space is seen, how it is entered, how it is understood. And that adds another layer to its purpose, because now it is not just a place that functions, it is a place that is experienced. And then, like many sites in the region, its active use comes to an end. The terraces remain, the structure holds, but the activity fades. And what is left is the design, still visible, still precise, still interacting with the environment, in the same way it always did. And that creates a quiet kind of continuity, because even without the people who built it, the system still exists. The terraces still define space. The variations in conditions still occur. The structure still responds to the landscape. And maybe that's what makes Moray stand out, because it shows a level of understanding that goes beyond simple construction. It shows adaptation, experimentation, and the ability to shape the environment in a way that creates something both functional and structured. And even now, looking down into those circles, the pattern remains clear. Not random, not natural in the usual sense, but created, layer by layer, until the mountain itself became part of the design. And that design still holds, quiet, precise, and still reflecting the decisions of the people who built it, long after they are gone.